You have seen this painting before. Not in a gallery, necessarily. Not standing before the real thing in the Uffizi in Florence, in the long room where it hangs, where the crowds gather and the cameras come out, and people spend approximately 45 seconds in front of one of the greatest paintings ever made before moving on to the next one. You may never have been to Florence. It doesn't matter. You have seen this painting. You have seen it on posters and tote bags and coffee mugs and the covers of art history textbooks and the walls of student rooms and the backgrounds of advertisements for things that have nothing to do with art. You have seen it so many times in so many contexts, reduced to so many different sizes and purposes that you may have stopped seeing it entirely. It has become wallpaper. It has become shorthand. It has become the painting you already know, which is another way of saying the painting you no longer look at. Tonight we are going to look at it. Not quickly. Not in the 45 seconds the gallery crowds allow. We are going to look at it the way it was meant to be looked at. Slowly, privately, in a quiet room, with time enough to let it become strange again. Because it is strange. Stranger than its familiarity allows you to see. Stranger than almost anything else hanging in any museum in the world, if you give it long enough and look carefully enough and let yourself forget for a while that you have seen it before. The painting is called The Birth of Venus. It was made by Sandro Botticelli, probably between 1484 and 1486 in Florence, for a patron whose identity we are not entirely certain of, to hang in a location we cannot definitively establish, for purposes that scholars have been debating for 500 years. It is nearly 3 meters wide and almost 2 meters tall, large enough, if you stood before it, to feel as though you might walk into it and find yourself standing on the shore it depicts in the warm salt air, with the roses falling around you and the goddess arriving from the sea. It lives now in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, where it has been since the 18th century, and where it is one of the most visited paintings in the world. Millions of people have stood before it. Millions more have seen it reproduced. And yet most of them, if asked, could not tell you what is actually happening in it. Could not name the figures. Could not explain why a nude woman standing on a shell is one of the most philosophically complex images of the entire Renaissance. Could not say why the greens have darkened, or why the canvas was an unusual choice, or why Venus's body is anatomically wrong in ways Botticelli almost certainly knew about, and chose anyway. These are the things we are going to talk about tonight. All of them, and more, and slowly. We have all the time we need. Let us begin with what you think you know. A woman standing on a shell in the sea. She is naked and she is beautiful, and her hair is very long and very gold, and it moves in the wind. On her left, two figures are blowing that wind, a man and a woman, entwined, their cheeks puffed with breath, their bodies horizontal in the air above the waves. On her right, a woman in a flowered dress reaches toward her with a cloak, as though hurrying to cover her before the world can look too long. Behind all of them, an orange grove and the sea and a sky that is neither day nor night, but something in between, the particular light of myth which obeys none of the rules of actual weather. That is what you think you know. Now, let us look again. The first thing to understand about this painting is its size. Almost 3 meters wide, nearly 2 meters tall. These are not the dimensions you carry in your head from the poster or the postcard or the thumbnail on your phone. The painting you have been seeing all your life is a small thing, a contained thing, a thing that fits comfortably in your field of vision without asking anything of your body. The actual painting does not fit comfortably anywhere. It demands space. It demands distance. It demands that you step back and then step back again before you can take in the whole of it. And even then, the edges push at the periphery of your vision, insisting on more attention than you have given them. And Venus herself, at this scale, is life-size. More than life-size, perhaps, she is idealized, which means she is slightly larger than a real woman standing on a real shell in a real sea, slightly more present, slightly more impossible to ignore. She does not recede into the canvas. She comes forward from it toward the person standing before her and the effect of standing before her, which you may or may not have experienced, but which countless accounts confirm, is not the calm aesthetic appreciation that reproduction suggests. It is something more like being found. The second thing to understand is the surface. Botticelli painted this on canvas, which sounds unremarkable until you know that canvas was still unusual for a major Florentine mythological painting of this scale in the 1480s. Panel was the standard support, thick wooden boards, carefully prepared, heavy and stable and designed for permanence. Canvas was cheaper, lighter, and more portable. It was the kind of support you chose when you were making something for a private space rather than a public or ecclesiastical one, something that might need to be moved, rolled, transported from a city palace to a country villa. The choice of canvas is itself a clue about what this painting was for and who it was for and where it was expected to live. Not a church. Not a civic hall. Somewhere private. Somewhere domestic. Somewhere that the presence of a naked goddess on the wall was not a scandal but a statement of learning, of taste, of the particular intellectual confidence of a Florentine elite that believed it could hold classical mythology and Christian faith in the same room without either one destroying the other. The canvas was assembled from 2 sewn pieces. You can see the join, if you know where to look, running horizontally across the middle of the painting. It was prepared with a tinted gesso ground, and the composition was worked out carefully, with underdrawing and revisions. Botticelli changed the position of the whore's sandals. He adjusted Venus's hair. There are pentimenti, ghosts of earlier decisions visible beneath the final surface, that tell us the painting was not born fully formed from a single inspired vision, but was worked out and reconsidered and adjusted the way all real paintings are, by a man in a studio making decisions under the pressure of his own standards. The gold is real. Applied after the main painting was complete, the gold highlights that catch the light in Venus's hair, on the wings of the wind figures, on the cloak, on the shell, these were added with the kind of care that suggests Botticelli understood exactly what gold does in a painting, which is not simply to indicate wealth or importance, but to insist on a different order of reality. Gold does not behave like paint. It does not absorb light the way pigment does. It reflects. It moves with the viewer's movement. It says, this is not the ordinary world. This is something else. Pay attention differently. And the colors are not what Botticelli painted. This is one of the most important and least discussed facts about the painting, and it changes everything about how you understand what you are seeing. The greens in Zephyr's wings, in his companion, in the orange grove behind the figures, have darkened significantly over 5 centuries of exposure. The green pigments Botticelli used were not stable in the long term, and what began as a fresh, luminous, living green has become, in many areas, something darker and cooler and more muted than he intended. The color balance of the painting has shifted. The relationship between the warm flesh tones and the cool greens, a relationship Botticelli calibrated with great care, is not the relationship you are seeing. You are seeing the painting after time has had its say. The painting Botticelli's first viewers saw was brighter, more chromatic, more alive with contrast, more evidently a painting of spring, rather than of something more ambiguous and autumnal. A varnish layer applied in later centuries further altered the appearance, darkening the whole surface and giving it the amber warmth that old paintings often seem to have, a warmth that belongs to the varnish rather than the artist's intention. Conservation work has removed much of this, revealing a lighter, more delicate color balance. But the greens remain changed. When you look at this painting, you are looking at a survival, not an original, at what 500 years of chemistry has permitted to remain. Now Venus herself. She stands, if standing is the right word for something so precarious, so defiant of physics, on the curved inner surface of an enormous shell, which itself rides the surface of a calm and improbably colored sea. She is nude. She is not simply undressed. She is nude in the specific sense that art history uses the word, which means her nakedness is not incidental, but the subject, the point, the thing the painting is organized around and asking you to think about. Her pose comes from classical antiquity. It has a name, the Venus Pudica, the modest Venus, a type of classical sculpture in which the goddess is shown nude but covering herself with her hands, one hand across her breasts, one across her lower body, in a gesture that acknowledges being seen while asserting a kind of simultaneous privacy. The pose was known in Botticelli's Florence through ancient sculptures, including the Medici Venus, a celebrated classical figure that was already in the Medici collection and that Botticelli certainly knew. But Botticelli's Venus is not the Medici Venus. She is not classical in the way that marble sculptures are classical, not bounded, not resolved, not at rest in her own body. Her proportions are wrong by any naturalistic standard. Her neck is too long. Her shoulders slope at an angle that human shoulders do not slope. Her left arm, raised to cover her breast, connects to her shoulder at an angle that anatomy does not permit. Her right hip is too high. Her body is, in the technical sense, incorrect. And Botticelli knew this. He was not a painter who lacked the skill to render the human body accurately. His other works demonstrate a full command of anatomy when he chose to deploy it. He chose here not to deploy it. He chose instead to elongate, to stylize, to make the body a line rather than a volume, to trade anatomical accuracy for a quality that is harder to name, a quality of fragility, of inwardness, of being present in the world without quite belonging to it. Venus in this painting does not look comfortable in her body. She looks as though the body is something she is wearing temporarily, something that belongs to the world of matter and time, while she belongs to something else. Her face reinforces this. She is not looking at us. She is not looking at the wind figures or at the horror reaching out with the cloak. She is looking at something we cannot see, somewhere to the right of the frame and slightly downward, a gaze that is not directed at any person or object in the painting or outside it, but that seems directed inward at something private, at some thought or knowledge or sadness that belongs to her alone. Her expression is melancholy, not the dramatic, readable melancholy of a figure in distress, but a quieter, more permanent kind, the melancholy of someone who has always known something that the rest of the world is still in the process of discovering. It is an expression that does not belong on the face of a goddess arriving in triumph. It belongs on the face of someone who understands exactly what arrival costs. Walter Pater, the 19th-century critic who more than anyone else was responsible for Botticelli's recovery from obscurity, wrote about this quality in Venus's face with the precision that only very close looking produces. He saw in Botticelli's women a particular kind of beauty that was inseparable from sorrow, beauty that had looked at the world clearly and not been comforted by what it saw. This is not a conventional reading of a painting that most people associate with lightness and spring and the celebration of beauty. But it is a true one, and it is available to anyone who looks long enough and does not let the familiarity of the image prevent the looking. The hair. It is the first thing most people see, before the face, before the body, before anything else. That extraordinary fall of gold hair, blown sideways by the wind, one strand crossing her body to rest across her hip in place of the hand that might otherwise cover her. It is impossibly long. It is impossibly gold. It is impossibly mobile, behaving like water and light simultaneously, and Botticelli has painted each strand individually. A feat of patience and control that speaks to how seriously he took this particular element of the image. The hair is doing more than one thing at once. It is, in the most literal sense, covering her. That single strand across her hip is part of the painting's system of modesty, its negotiation between displaying Venus and protecting her. It is a visual rhyme with the gesture of her hands, adding a third element to the modest covering that the pose alone could not quite achieve. It is also a demonstration of painterly virtuosity, a passage of the painting that declares, quietly but clearly, that the person who made this was operating at the absolute limit of what tempera on canvas can be asked to do. And it connects to something specific in the literary sources Botticelli was drawing on. Poliziano's Stanze per la Giostra, a poem written by the scholar Angelo Poliziano for a tournament staged by Giuliano de' Medici in 1475, contains a passage describing Venus arriving from the sea that Botticelli appears to have read and used directly. Poliziano describes the goddess pressing her hair with her hands, the hair moving in the wind, the shell carrying her to shore. The parallels with the painting are close enough that most scholars accept the stanza as one of Botticelli's primary sources, though not the only one and not a blueprint that the painting simply illustrates. Botticelli was reading Poliziano the way a great painter reads a great poem, not to copy it, but to be changed by it, to find in its images something that painting can do that poetry cannot. On the left, the wind figures. Two of them entwined horizontal above the waves, a man and a woman, or a god and a nymph, their bodies wrapped together, their cheeks rounded with the breath they are releasing across the water toward Venus. The man is Zephyr, the west wind, the gentle warm wind of spring that in classical tradition accompanies Venus and enables her arrival. The woman he holds, and she is most often identified as either Chloris or Aura, another wind nymph, is less clearly identified, and the ambiguity is probably deliberate. Botticelli is painting wind, which by definition takes no single fixed form. Their bodies in flight have a quality that is not quite physical and not quite supernatural. They are solid enough to cast shadow, light enough to float, their drapery streaming behind them in the same wind they are creating. The roses they release, floating between the wind figures and Venus, suspended in the charged air between one part of the painting and another, are pink, and they fall and they do not land, because this is not a world where things simply fall. This is a world where everything is suspended in the moment of arrival, the moment before things settle into the ordinary. The roses are Venus's flower, sacred to her in classical tradition, born in some versions of the myth from the same foam that gave birth to Venus herself, springing up wherever she walked. They are also simply beautiful, and Botticelli knew that beauty in painting does not always need to signify anything beyond itself. Sometimes a rose is a rose, and sometimes it is a rose, and it is also a symbol, and it is also a demonstration of what a painter can do with pink tempera and a fine brush and 500 years of patience still ahead of it. On the right, the Hora. She is running or moving quickly, her body leaning forward with a sense of urgency toward Venus, holding out a cloak printed with flowers, ready to drape it around the goddess before the world can look any longer. The Horae were the goddesses of the seasons in Greek mythology, guardians of the gates of Olympus, associated with the orderly progression of time and with the transformation of the natural world across the year. This one is most often identified as the Hora of spring, appropriate given that Venus's arrival heralds the season and that everything in this painting, the roses, the orange grove, the warm wind, speaks of spring's return. Her dress is one of the most beautiful passages in the painting. White scattered with flowers, cornflowers and daisies and other small blooms, painted with a delicacy that suggests Botticelli was working at the edge of what his brush could do. She wears a garland of flowers in her hair and flowers at her waist, and the cloak she holds is itself patterned with an elaborate floral design. Everything about her is botanical, seasonal, of the earth, which places her in deliberate contrast to Venus, who belongs to no season and no earth, who has arrived from somewhere else and is merely passing through this world on her way to whatever comes next. The cloak she carries is the cloak of the world's attempt to clothe what cannot finally be clothed, to contain what exceeds containment, to make ordinary what is by nature extraordinary. Venus will receive it, and she will wear it, and she will enter the world of time and season and human life. But the painting catches her before that happens. Catches her in the last moment of her freedom, naked, arrived, not yet covered, the wind still in her hair and the roses still falling, and the world still reaching for her and not quite touching. The orange grove behind her, dark trees, heavy with fruit, pressing close to the right edge of the painting, giving the Hora a backdrop that is simultaneously natural and symbolic. Orange trees in Florentine Renaissance painting are not simply orange trees. They carry a specific set of associations that a 15th-century Florentine viewer would have read immediately, and that we have to work slightly harder to recover. the orange was a Medici symbol. The Medici family used golden balls, pale, as their heraldic emblem, and oranges, with their golden fruit against dark leaves, were understood in Florentine visual culture as a natural analogue to the Medici pale. A grove of orange trees in a painting almost certainly connected to the Medici circle is not a neutral backdrop. It is a quiet statement of patronage and ownership, an acknowledgement of whose world Venus is arriving into and who has made her arrival possible. Whether this reading was intended by Botticelli, by the patron, or by both simultaneously, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that a 15th-century Florentine standing before this painting in a Medici villa would have seen the orange grove and understood something that most modern viewers do not, that Venus was arriving, in some sense, into Medici territory, that the goddess of love and beauty and the Neo-Platonic ideal had come, as it were, to the right address. Now step back and take the whole painting in. A goddess on a shell, blown to shore by the wind, about to be clothed by spring, against a sea that is more philosophical than physical, and a sky that has never been seen outside of painting. Gold in the hair and on the wings and at the edges of things. Greens that have darkened with time but still suggest the freshness of a world beginning. A body that is anatomically wrong and spiritually perfect. A face that is looking at something we will never see. This is not a simple painting. It has never been a simple painting. It became simple only through reproduction, through the reduction of its 3 meters of tempera and gold and 500 years of survival to a rectangle small enough to fit on a tote bag. The original is not simple. The original is strange and large and slightly sad and full of questions that it does not answer and was never designed to answer. We have been looking at the surface. Now we need to go deeper into the story behind the image, into the world that produced it, into the man who painted it, and the city he painted it in, and the philosophy that made a nude goddess not just acceptable, but necessary. All of that is waiting. And we have all night. To understand why this painting exists, why a nude pagan goddess on a shell was not only acceptable, but celebrated in one of the most devoutly Christian cities in 15th century Europe, you need to understand something about how the people who commissioned it and looked at it understood the relationship between beauty and truth, between the body and the soul, between the myths of ancient Greece and the faith of Christian Florence. The answer is philosophy. A very specific philosophy, developed in a very specific place by a very specific group of men who gathered around the most powerful family in Florence and who believed, with the particular intensity of people who have found an idea that reorganizes everything, that Plato and Christ were saying the same thing. This sounds unlikely. It was unlikely. It was also one of the most fertile intellectual experiments of the Renaissance, and it produced, among many other things, the birth of Venus. The man at the center of this experiment was Marsilio Ficino. Ficino was born in 1433, the son of a doctor in the service of Cosimo de' Medici, the elder Cosimo, the grandfather of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and from his earliest years he was identified as someone of unusual intellectual gifts and steered accordingly. Cosimo de' Medici had a project, the translation of Plato's complete works into Latin, which had never been done and which Cosimo believed would transform European thought. He chose Ficino to do it. He gave him a villa at Careggi outside Florence and a library and the time and resources to work. And Ficino spent his life there, translating and writing and gathering around him a circle of scholars and poets and artists who called themselves, with the earnest self-importance of people who believe they are doing something historically significant, the Platonic Academy. Ficino's central argument, developed across decades of writing and correspondence and conversation in that villa at Careggi, was that Platonic philosophy and Christian theology were not in conflict but in harmony. That Plato had, through reason and contemplation, arrived at truths that Christianity had received through revelation. That beauty, physical, visible, sensory beauty, was not a distraction from the divine, but a path toward it. That when you looked at a beautiful face or a beautiful painting and felt the particular upwelling of feeling that beauty produces, you were not experiencing something merely earthly and therefore suspect. You were experiencing, in Ficino's framework, the first movement of the soul toward God. This is an important idea, and it is worth staying with for a moment. In the dominant tradition of medieval Christian thought, the body and its pleasures were suspect. Earthly beauty was a snare, something that could distract the soul from its true destination, that could become an end in itself, rather than a pointer toward the transcendent. The appropriate response to physical beauty in this tradition was caution. Acknowledgement of its power, followed by redirection of attention toward higher things. Ficino proposed something different. Beauty in his framework was not a snare, but a ladder. You did not need to turn away from it. You needed to follow it, to let the experience of physical beauty lead you upward through successive levels of understanding toward the source of all beauty, which was God. The soul that stopped at the bottom of the ladder and mistook physical beauty for the destination had made an error. But the solution was not to abandon the ladder. The solution was to climb. Within this framework, Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, could be understood in two registers simultaneously. There was earthly Venus, Venere vulgar, associated with physical desire, with the body, with the lower levels of the ladder. And there was heavenly Venus, Venere celeste, associated with divine love, with the soul's ascent, with the highest reaches of what beauty can mean. The two were not opposites. They were stages on the same journey. And a painting of Venus, nude, arrived from the sea, on the threshold between the water and the land, could be understood as a painting of that threshold itself. The moment when beauty enters the world. The moment when the divine puts on a body and becomes visible. This is why the birth of Venus was not scandalous in its own time in the way that a painting of a nude woman might seem like it should have been. It was not simply a nude. It was a philosophical statement dressed, or rather undressed, in the most beautiful form its maker could devise. It was an argument about the relationship between beauty and divinity, made in the language that argument most powerfully takes in the Renaissance, paint. Whether the people who looked at it understood all of this, or whether they simply found it beautiful and left the philosophy to the scholars, is a question we cannot answer. Probably both. Probably everything in between. This is how great paintings work. They operate simultaneously at the level of immediate sensory experience and at the level of deep intellectual structure, and you do not need to access both levels to be moved by them. But the intellectual structure is there, and knowing it changes what you see. The question of who commissioned this painting has occupied scholars for generations, and the honest answer is that we do not know with absolute certainty. The most persuasive candidate is Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de' Medici, a younger member of the Medici family, a cousin of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was himself deeply embedded in the Neo-Platonic intellectual world of Florence and who had a documented relationship with Botticelli. We know that Marsilio Ficino wrote a letter to Lorenzo di Pier Francesco when the young man was 15, describing Venus as an allegory of humanitas, of the fullness of human virtue and potential, and urging him to keep her before him as a model. We know that Botticelli worked for the Medici throughout his career. We know that the painting was associated with Medici collections. What we do not know, because no document has survived to tell us, is whether the commission was explicit. Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco saying to Botticelli, "Paint me this," or whether it emerged more organically from the intellectual atmosphere of the Medici circle, from conversations and ideas that eventually crystallized into a painting without a single moment of commission we can point to. The villa at Castello, a Medici property outside Florence, was for a long time proposed as the original location of both the birth of Venus and the Primavera, based on an inventory description from the 16th century. But more recent scholarship has complicated this. The inventory description is not precise enough to confirm the identification with certainty, and the argument that both paintings were made for Castello and displayed there together as a philosophical program has weakened considerably under scrutiny. What remains is the Medici connection, strong, almost certain, and the intellectual context, Neo-Platonic, Ficinian, steeped in the particular atmosphere of that circle. The specific room in the specific villa remains tantalizingly unestablished. Now the question that always comes: who is she? The woman whose face Venus wears? The model, if there was a model? The real person, if there was a real person, behind the idealized figure on the shell? The most famous answer, the one that has been repeated in books and documentaries and gallery labels for well over a century, is Simonetta Vespucci. Simonetta Cataneo Vespucci was a young noblewoman of Genoese origin who had come to Florence through her marriage to Marco Vespucci, a member of a prominent Florentine family. She arrived in the city around 1469, and almost immediately she became the object of a particular kind of Florentine attention, the attention that a beautiful, cultivated, and apparently charming young woman attracts in a city that has made the idealization of beauty into a philosophical program. She was celebrated by poets. She was painted, or at least depicted, by artists. She was associated in the gossip and the poetry of the time with Giuliano de' Medici, Lorenzo's younger brother, the man for whom the tournament that inspired Poliziano's stanze was staged. Whether their relationship was romantic, platonic, or purely the product of poetic convention, the tradition of the idealized lady, the Donna Angelicata, is something the documents do not settle. Simonetta died in 1476. She was 23 years old. She died of consumption, tuberculosis, and the speed and youth of her death gave her beauty the additional charge that early death gives to beauty in a culture already inclined to idealize it. She became, in the years after her death, a kind of Florentine myth, the most beautiful woman lost too soon, her face preserved only in the art and poetry that had tried to capture her while she lived. The problem with the Simonetta theory as an explanation for the face of Venus is straightforward. She died approximately 8 years before the birth of Venus was painted. Botticelli was not painting from life. He was painting from memory, or from earlier portraits, or from an idealized image that had accumulated in the cultural imagination of Florence in the years since her death, the Simonetta of legend rather than the Simonetta of the room. Some scholars have argued that a sequence of female faces in Botticelli's work, across paintings separated by years, share enough features to suggest a consistent model, and that model is identified as Simonetta. The argument has a romantic logic, the painter in love with the dead woman, returning again and again to her face, reconstructing it across decades from whatever he could remember or recover. It is a beautiful theory. It is not provable, and it rests on a subjective reading of facial resemblance that different scholars have assessed very differently. The more cautious scholarly position is that Simonetta was a powerful presence in the cultural memory of Botticelli's Florence, that her face and her story had become part of the atmosphere in which the painting was made, and that she may have contributed to the ideal type that Botticelli associated with Venus, without necessarily being the direct source of the features we see. She was one ingredient in an image that was always more than any single person. The face on the shell is not a portrait. It is an ideal. And ideals absorb many sources without being reducible to any one of them. Sandro Botticelli was born Alessandro di Mariano Filippi in Florence, probably in 1444 or 1445, the youngest of several children. His father, Mariano Filippi, was a tanner, a craftsman, prosperous enough to own property and educate his children, but not a member of Florence's elite. The nickname Botticelli, meaning little barrel, was originally his older brother Giovanni's, given for his stout build, and it passed to Alessandro by the particular logic of family nicknames that attach themselves wherever they land and refuse to leave. He would be Botticelli for the rest of his life and for all of the centuries after it. He was apprenticed, probably in the early 1460s, to Fra Filippo Lippi, one of the most significant painters working in Florence at the time, a Carmelite friar whose life story was considerably more turbulent than his ecclesiastical office might suggest. Fra Filippo had been accused of seducing a nun, had fathered a son by her, Filippino Lippi, who would himself become a significant painter, and had been released from his vows by Pope Pius II, apparently on the grounds that his considerable artistic gifts outweighed his monastic failings. He was charming, technically brilliant, and a painter of great delicacy and warmth, and what he gave Botticelli was a foundation in line, in the use of contour as the primary means of defining form, that would shape everything Botticelli ever made. The linear quality of Botticelli's work, the way his figures are defined by the sweep and pressure of their outlines rather than by the modeling of light and shadow, comes directly from Fra Filippo. But Botticelli took that inheritance and made it into something his teacher had never done, a tool for capturing not just the appearance of forms, but their inner life, their particular quality of being, the specific emotional temperature of a gesture or an expression rendered in a single unbroken line. By the 1470s, Botticelli was established in Florence, running his own workshop, producing altarpieces and portraits, and the devotional images that sustained most painters in a city where the church was the primary source of commissions. He had come to the attention of the Medici, the inevitable destination for any talented artist in Florence, and had begun the relationship that would define his middle career. He painted portraits of members of the family. He was included in the cultural projects that the Medici sponsored. He moved, if not in the inner circle of the Platonic Academy, then in the atmosphere it created, absorbing its ideas, internalizing its aesthetic values, translating its philosophical concerns into images with a fluency that suggests genuine understanding rather than merely competent illustration. In 1481, he was summoned to Rome. Pope Sixtus IV was undertaking the decoration of his new chapel, the Sistine Chapel, the same building whose ceiling Michelangelo would paint 3 decades later, and he wanted the finest painters in Italy. Botticelli was among those chosen, alongside Ghirlandaio, Perugino, and others. He spent approximately a year in Rome, painting 3 large fresco cycles on the walls of the chapel, scenes from the life of Moses and the life of Christ, arranged as typological pairs on opposite walls. The frescoes are still there, though they are almost never discussed, overshadowed entirely by what Michelangelo did to the ceiling a generation later. They are not Botticelli's greatest work, but they are the work of a painter at the height of his technical command, confident and authoritative in a way that the earlier Florence paintings are not quite yet. He returned to Florence in 1482, and it is in the years immediately following, the middle 1480s, that the birth of Venus was made. He was around 40 years old. He was at the peak of his powers. And Florence was at the peak of something too, a particular moment of confidence and cultivation and intellectual ambition that the people living through it may not have known was extraordinary, but that history has judged to be among the most remarkable concentrations of artistic genius in any city at any time. Florence in the 1480s. It is difficult to convey what this city was at this moment to anyone who has not thought carefully about the specific circumstances that produced it. Not large by the standards of the great cities of the ancient world, perhaps 60 or 70,000 people in a city that was physically compact, walkable, its major monuments within a few minutes of each other on foot. Not wealthy by the standards of Venice, which controlled vast trading networks and had accumulated treasure across centuries of maritime commerce. Not militarily powerful, not an empire, not a city that shaped the political destiny of Europe in the way that Rome or Paris or Madrid did. And yet, in the 1480s, the Uffizi Gallery had not yet been built. It would come a century later, but the paintings that would fill it were being made right now in workshops a few streets from where you might be standing. Botticelli was painting the birth of Venus. Leonardo da Vinci, who had trained in Florence and would return to it, was developing the ideas that would eventually become the Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. Ghirlandaio was running a busy workshop whose apprentices included, at this very moment, a 14-year-old boy named Michelangelo Buonarroti. Poliziano was writing the poetry that fed Botticelli's images. Ficino was translating Plato. Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, was writing sonnets and governing a city-state with the particular skill of someone who understood that power and culture are not separate things, but the same thing expressed differently. This is not coincidence. It is the result of specific conditions that Florence had assembled over the previous century, a mercantile economy that produced surplus wealth and directed it toward cultural production, a civic tradition that valued artistic achievement as a form of civic identity, a patronage system that connected talented individuals with the resources they needed, and, above all, the Medici, a family that understood, perhaps better than any other ruling family of the period, that the most durable form of power is not military or economic, but cultural. Lorenzo de' Medici was not a great general. He was not a great merchant. He was a great patron, a great politician, and a genuinely accomplished poet, a man who believed that the proper use of wealth was the creation of beauty, and who backed that belief with the considerable resources of the most successful banking family in Europe. Under his sponsorship, Florence in the 1480s was a city where a painter could be a philosopher, where a philosopher could be a poet, where the boundaries between disciplines that we now treat as separate were understood as permeable, even illusory. Where Botticelli could read Ficino, reading Plato, and make a painting that was simultaneously a nude and a theological argument and a demonstration of extraordinary technical skill, and have all three of those things understood and appreciated by the people who looked at it. The condition would not last. Nothing that concentrated ever does. In the 1490s, a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola began preaching in Florence with an intensity and a certainty that the city had not heard before. Savonarola was not a subtle man. He was not interested in Neo-Platonic accommodations between pagan philosophy and Christian faith, in the idea that beauty was a ladder to God, in the proposition that Venus could be read as an allegory of the soul's ascent. He believed that Florence had sinned, had given itself over to luxury and vanity and pagan corruption, and that God's punishment was imminent. He preached it with a vividness and a conviction that crowds of thousands came to hear, and that gradually, over the course of the decade, changed the atmosphere of the city in ways that even the Medici could not fully control. Lorenzo the Magnificent died in 1492. The same year Columbus reached the Americas, a coincidence that feels almost too neat, as though history knew it was marking the end of one world and the beginning of another. His son Piero proved unequal to the pressures he inherited, and in 1494 the Medici were expelled from Florence, driven out by a combination of popular resentment, political miscalculation, and the arrival of a French army that Piero had spectacularly failed to manage. Savonarola stepped into the vacuum they left, and for the next 4 years he effectively governed Florence's moral life, if not its political one, preaching repentance and reform with increasing intensity. In 1497, he organized the Bonfire of the Vanities. Florentines were encouraged, pressured in some cases, to bring their worldly goods to the central piazza and burn them. Mirrors, fine clothes, books, playing cards, works of art. Anything that could be classified as vain, as luxury, as the kind of attachment to earthly beauty that Savonarola believed was keeping Florence from God. Vasari, writing decades later, claimed that Botticelli burned some of his own paintings in the Bonfire of the Vanities, that the painter who had made Venus and the Primavera destroyed his own work in a fit of religious conviction. Whether this is true cannot be confirmed. Vasari is not always reliable, and the claim has the quality of a moral tale, the artist punished by his own repentance, that makes it suspect as biography, even if it might be true as symbol. What is certain is that Botticelli's late work changed. The luminous mythological paintings of the 1480s gave way to images that are more austere, more emotionally intense, more explicitly concerned with suffering and faith and the violence of sacred history. Whether this reflects genuine religious transformation, the change market of a city under Savonarola's influence, or simply the natural evolution of an aging painter's sensibility, or all three simultaneously, is not something the record settles. Savonarola himself did not survive the decade he had transformed. In 1498 he was arrested, tried for heresy and sedition, and executed in the same piazza where the bonfire of the Vanities had burned. Hanged first, then burned, his body turned to ash in a square where his followers had burned other men's paintings the year before. History's ironies are rarely subtle. Botticelli survived Savonarola by 12 years. He died in 1510, probably in his mid-60s, in the city where he had been born and had never really left. The Florence he died in was not the Florence in which he had made his greatest work. The Medici had returned, but in a different form. The extraordinary confluence of the 1480s had dissolved. The world had moved on toward the high Renaissance and toward painters, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, whose work made Botticelli seem, to the tastes of the early 16th century, old-fashioned. Too linear, too Gothic. Too much in love with outline and not enough with volume and mass and the full sculptural rendering of the human form. He died without a will. He was buried in the church of Ognissanti in Florence, where his grave can still be found today, in the same church, as it happens, where Amerigo Vespucci, the explorer whose given name was attached to the continents that Columbus had reached in the year Lorenzo de' Medici died, had his family chapel. Florence is a small city. Its connections are dense and unexpected, and they keep appearing when you least expect them. After his death, Botticelli was forgotten. Not immediately and not completely. His works were still in churches and collections, still visible to anyone who looked. but his name ceased to matter. The Great Survey of Italian Artists, published by Giorgio Vasari in 1550, included him, but briefly and with reservations, noting his skill while implying his limitations, placing him firmly in the category of painters who had been superseded by greater men. For the next 3 centuries, Botticelli occupied the middle distance of art history, present but not prominent, acknowledged but not celebrated, his paintings admired by specialists without generating the popular enthusiasm that would make him famous. The recovery, when it came from an unexpected direction. The Pre-Raphaelites were a group of young English painters who, in the late 1840s, decided that the history of Western art had gone badly wrong at approximately the moment Raphael appeared, that the High Renaissance, for all its technical brilliance, had sacrificed something essential in the pursuit of idealized grandeur. What it had sacrificed, in their view, was sincerity, the direct, unmediated engagement with nature and feeling that the painters before Raphael had possessed, and that the painters after him had trained themselves out of. Looking for alternatives to the tradition they rejected, they found Botticelli. And what they found in him was precisely what the High Renaissance had not. That quality of line, of inwardness, of figures that seemed to be feeling things more intensely than their painted surfaces should be able to contain. The melancholy that Walter Pater would later articulate so precisely, the beauty shadowed by sorrow, the ideal always slightly touched by loss, spoke directly to the pre-Raphaelite sensibility, which was itself deeply invested in the relationship between beauty and pain. Walter Pater's essay on Botticelli, published in 1870 and revised for his collection The Renaissance in 1873, remains one of the most influential pieces of art criticism ever written. Influential not because it is academically rigorous, which by modern standards it is not, but because it gave readers a language for what they felt when they looked at Botticelli's paintings and had not yet been able to say. Pater described Botticelli as a painter whose work carries a distinctive quality of sadness, a sadness that is not the sadness of grief or loss in any particular sense, but something more fundamental, a sadness built into the structure of the world itself, visible to those who look at things long enough and honestly enough. He described Venus in The Birth of Venus as a figure who seems to have arrived not in triumph but in a kind of willing melancholy, beautiful, present, already aware of what beauty costs. This reading changed how the painting was seen, and how it was seen changed how many people came to see it. And how many people came to see it over the decades that followed, transformed it from a significant Renaissance painting into something approaching a cultural religion, one of those images whose reproduction has so thoroughly saturated the visual landscape that almost everyone alive today has encountered it without choosing to, and almost no one can look at it without the accumulated weight of all those prior encounters pressing down on the experience. This is the painting's strange condition in the world today. It is simultaneously the most famous and the least seen painting in the Uffizi. Most famous because it has been reproduced everywhere, least seen because the reproduction has made genuine looking almost impossible. You arrive at it already full of it, and you have to work to empty yourself enough to let the actual painting in. Tonight in the dark, with nothing pressing and nowhere to be, that emptying is possible. It is happening already. The tote bag and the textbook and the thumbnail are receding, and what remains is a large canvas, nearly 3 meters wide, painted in tempera and gold in Florence in the middle 1480s, by a man who was 40 years old and at the height of his powers, and in the middle of the most extraordinary cultural moment his city had ever produced. And a woman on a shell in the sea, with the wind in her hair and spring waiting to clothe her, and an expression on her face that has not been fully explained in 500 years. The night has moved further along now. Let everything that has just been said find its place. The philosophy, the city, the painter, the woman who may or may not have been the model, the century that forgot him, and the century that found him again. Let it settle the way things settle in the dark when there is no hurry and no destination. We will return to the painting once more, to the question of its relationship with the Primavera you already know, to what the painting means in the context of the whole of Botticelli's career, and to the long, strange journey of its survival. But all of that can wait a little longer. The shell is still on the water. The wind is still blowing. Venus is still arriving. She has been arriving for 540 years, and she is in no hurry. There is another painting. You have seen it too, if you have been watching this channel from the beginning, because it was the first painting we looked at together in the first episode of The Painted Night, on the first night this channel existed. Botticelli's Primavera. Spring. The grove of orange trees, the three graces, Mercury dispersing the clouds, Flora scattering flowers across the path, the nymph Chloris being transformed at the right edge of the canvas, and at the center, presiding over everything with that same inward, slightly melancholy gaze, Venus. The same Venus, or a Venus so close to the same that the distance between them is one of the most debated questions in Botticelli scholarship. The Primavera was painted first, probably around 1477 or 1478, several years before the birth of Venus. It is larger, nearly 3.5 meters wide, more than 2 meters tall, and it is painted on panel rather than canvas, which already tells you something. It was made for a more permanent location, less portable, less likely to be moved between a city residence and a country villa. And where the birth of Venus isolates its figures against a sky and a sea, the Primavera places them in a grove, enclosed, interior, the orange trees pressing close on all sides, the world outside the grove implied but never shown. The question that has occupied scholars for generations is simple to state and impossible to fully answer. Are these two paintings a pair? Were they made for the same location, to be seen together as two halves of a single philosophical program? Or are they related but independent works, sharing a patron, a subject, an intellectual atmosphere, but not designed to be displayed side by side as a unified statement? The arguments for a pair are substantial. Both paintings engage deeply with the same Neo-Platonic ideas, with Venus as a philosophical figure, with love and beauty as paths toward the divine, with the relationship between the classical and the Christian, the earthly and the heavenly. Both were associated at some point in their history with Medici collections and Medici spaces. Both feature Venus as a central or presiding figure, rendered with the same elongated inward quality, the same melancholy grace. Displayed together, they create a reading of Venus across two registers, arrived on the threshold, coming into the world in the birth of Venus, established, presiding, already fully present in the world in the Primavera. Birth and presence. Arrival and reign. Two moments in the same story, told in two paintings that hang across from each other and speak to each other across the room. This is a powerful reading, and the Uffizi displays the paintings in proximity precisely because it is powerful, because seeing them together does something to how you understand each one that neither can do alone. But the arguments against a pair are also substantial. The supports are different, panel and canvas. The dimensions, while similar in scale, are not identical. The dates of execution are separated by several years. And the documentary evidence that they were commissioned for the same location, for the same patron, as part of a single intended program. This evidence, which older scholarship assumed existed, has proved considerably more elusive than expected under closer examination. The claim that both paintings hung together at the Medici villa at Castello, which was repeated confidently in art historical writing for most of the 20th century, rests on a 16th century inventory description that is not precise enough to confirm the identification beyond doubt. The most careful scholars today hold the question open. They do not say the paintings are a pair because the evidence does not prove it. They do not say they are entirely independent because the connections between them are too deep and too consistent to be coincidental. They say these are strongly related works, made in the same intellectual atmosphere for the same circle of patrons by the same artist at related moments in his career. Whether they were designed to be physically displayed together is a question the documents have not yet answered. And perhaps the documents never will. What we can say, what standing before them together in the Uffizi makes undeniable, is that each painting illuminates the other without being reducible to it. The birth of Venus, seen after the Primavera, becomes the origin story of the world the Primavera depicts. Here is how Venus came to the world. Here is the moment of her arrival, the wind and the shell and the goddess balanced between the sea she came from and the land she is approaching. And the Primavera, seen after the birth of Venus, becomes what comes next. The world that Venus's arrival makes possible, the garden of love and beauty and mythological plenty that her presence generates. Read in sequence, they are a story. Read separately, each is a world. Both things are true simultaneously, and Botticelli, who was, among everything else, an artist of extraordinary intelligence, may have known that designing works that could be read both ways was more interesting, more durable, more generative of the kind of sustained looking that great painting requires than designing a program so tight and so explicit that it could only be read one way. If you watched the first episode of this channel, and you are watching this one, you have now seen both paintings. Not in the Uffizi, not in the same room, not with the physical experience of standing before them and feeling the size of them, and the specific quality of attention they demand. But you have been in the dark with both of them, slowly, for a long time, and that is its own form of knowing. And what you know, having been with both, is something that neither one could have given you alone. Now the painting's survival. Because it is not obvious that the birth of Venus should still exist. The history of art is also the history of what has been lost. The paintings burned, the frescoes plastered over, the panels used for firewood, the canvases cut up or destroyed, or simply neglected into nothing. For every painting that has come down to us across 5 or 6 centuries, there are probably dozens that have not. The survival of any old painting is, in some sense, a minor miracle of contingency, of the right decisions made at the right moments, of the right people choosing to preserve rather than destroy or sell or neglect. The birth of Venus survived in the first instance because it ended up in Medici hands and stayed there. The Medici, for all their political vicissitudes, the expulsion of 1494, the years of exile, the restoration, the eventual absorption of Florence into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany under Medici dukes, maintained their collections with a consistency that transcended their political fortunes. The paintings moved with the family, or were stored when the family moved, but they were not dispersed or destroyed. They were kept. painting survived Savonarola, which is not nothing given what the bonfire of the Vanities consumed. Whether it was hidden during the years of his influence, or simply kept in a Medici property where Savonarola's reach did not extend, or whether its status as a learned philosophical allegory rather than mere erotic display protected it even from the friar's censure, we cannot say. But it survived. It was not among the things burned. It passed through the generations of the Medici family, and eventually, in 1737, came to the Uffizi, the great gallery that the later Medici had built as an administrative center and which had gradually been transformed into one of the greatest repositories of art in the world. The last Medici, Anna Maria Luisa, died without heirs in that year, and she left the entire Medici collection to the state of Tuscany on one condition, that it remain in Florence, accessible to the public forever. It was an act of extraordinary foresight and generosity, and it is why the Uffizi is what it is today, not a private collection that might have been sold off or scattered across the capitals of Europe, but a public trust anchored in the city that produced it, available to anyone who walks through the door. The birth of Venus has been in the Uffizi since 1815, when it was moved from the Medici villa at Castello to the gallery. It was restored in the 20th century, most significantly in a campaign that removed much of the darkened varnish and revealed the lighter, more delicate color balance that had been obscured for generations. The greens remain changed. That damage is irreversible, but the overall surface is as close to Botticelli's intention as conservation can bring it without intervention that would be inappropriate for a painting of this significance. It hangs now in room 1014 of the Uffizi, in a long gallery specifically designed to hold the great Florentine paintings of the 15th century. The Primavera is nearby. The crowds are considerable, particularly in summer, when the line to enter the museum stretches around the building and the room itself is so full that the 45 seconds in front of the painting I mentioned at the beginning of this night is not a figure I invented, but a documented average, the time most visitors actually spend before the most visited painting in the museum. "45 seconds. For a painting that took Botticelli months at minimum to make. For a painting that contains a complete philosophical system about the nature of beauty and the soul's relationship to the divine. For a painting whose surface, examined closely, reveals individual brushstrokes of a delicacy and precision that is almost incomprehensible as a human achievement. For a painting whose colors have been changing for 500 years and are still changing slowly while the crowds move past it with their cameras. "45 seconds. This is what fame costs. This is what reproduction does to the real thing. It creates a demand so vast that the real thing can barely sustain it, can barely remain itself in the face of the millions who arrive already knowing it and leave without having fully seen it. But you have been with it tonight for much longer than 45 seconds. You have been with it in the dark, which is a different kind of seeing from the gallery crowd. You have been with it without a camera, without anyone pressing behind you, without the ambient noise of a museum in summer, or the pressure of everything else on the itinerary waiting to be ticked off. You have been with it the way Botticelli's first viewers were with it, privately in a domestic space, with time enough to look and look again, and let the looking change into something else. What that something else is hard to name. It is what happens when a painting stops being a painting you are looking at and becomes a painting that is doing something to you, changing the quality of your attention, or surfacing something you had not known you were thinking about, or simply giving you the particular experience of being in the presence of something made with complete commitment to what it was trying to do. Botticelli was completely committed. The elongated body, the anatomically impossible arm, the hair painted strand by strand, the gold applied after everything else was finished, the tempera worked to a surface so delicate that it required the most careful of all the conservation interventions the painting has received. These are the marks of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and refused every compromise his materials or his time might have permitted him. He was painting an idea. The idea that beauty is not separate from truth. That the experience of standing before something beautiful and feeling the particular quality of feeling that beauty produces, the upwelling, the recognition, the sense that something important is present, is not a distraction from meaning, but is meaning itself, arriving in the only form that meaning sometimes can arrive, through the senses, through the body, through the irreducible experience of being a creature who can look at things and be changed by what they see. Ficino believed this. Botticelli, in making this painting, demonstrated it. And 540 years later, the demonstration still holds. The painting is not finished arriving. This is perhaps the strangest thing about it, and the thing most worth sitting with as the night gets later, and the mind gets quieter, and the distance between you and the painting collapses a little further. Venus in the painting is in the act of arriving. That is what the composition depicts, not the completed arrival, not Venus already on the shore and clothed and absorbed into the world, but the moment just before. The shell still on the water, the wind still blowing, the horror still reaching, the cloak not yet around the goddess's shoulders. Everything suspended in the instant of threshold, between the sea and the land, between the mythological and the actual, between what has been and what is about to be. Botticelli chose this moment the way Caravaggio chose the during rather than the before or after, because the threshold is where meaning lives. Because completion is an ending, and endings close things down, and what he wanted was not closure but opening, an image that would remain permanently in the state of becoming, permanently on the edge of something that had not yet happened, permanently available to be looked at by anyone who came to it with enough time and enough quiet and enough willingness to be changed by what they saw. He succeeded, more completely than he could have known. The painting is still arriving in every sense, still coming into view for people who thought they already knew it, still giving up things that have been invisible, new scholarship, new conservation findings, new ways of reading its iconography, new readers of Walter Pater who find in his description something that changes how they look. Still arriving at the 45-second visitors who glance at it and feel something they did not expect, and occasionally stop, surprised, and look again. Still arriving tonight at you in the dark through whatever small channel this kind of transmission uses, words in the quiet, images in the mind, the particular attention that the end of the day and the beginning of sleep makes possible. The shell is still on the water. Venus is still balanced on it, impossibly, the way only painted things can be balanced, defying physics, defying time, defying the ordinary rules of what can and cannot last. Her hair is still moving in a wind that has been blowing since 1485 or 1486 and will blow for as long as the tempera holds and the canvas holds and there are eyes to look at it. Her face still carries that expression, the one that Pater saw and tried to name and could not quite. The one that is neither grief nor joy, but something older than both. The knowledge worn lightly of what it costs to be beautiful in a world that does not know what to do with beauty except to want it. She is not looking at us. She never looks at us, which is perhaps why we keep looking at her. The face that looks back tends to hold our gaze for a moment and then release it. The face that looks elsewhere holds us indefinitely, because we keep trying to follow the gaze, to find what it is looking at, to understand what she knows that we do not. We have been trying for 540 years. We will keep trying. This is not a failure. This is the painting working exactly as it was designed to work. Let her keep arriving now, in the dark. The wind figures have released their breath and the roses are still falling, and the hora is still reaching and the shell is still moving through water that has been still for 5 centuries. Let it all stay in motion the way it was made to stay, suspended, arriving, not yet resolved into anything as simple as completion. Botticelli painted this in Florence in the middle 1480s in a workshop somewhere in a city that was simultaneously the most cultivated and the most precarious place in Europe, a city balanced on the genius of one family, whose expulsion a decade later would end the particular world that made this painting possible. He painted it with tempera and gold on 2 pieces of sewn canvas in a tradition of making that required patience and precision, and the willingness to wait for each layer to dry before the next could begin. He painted a body that was anatomically wrong, because he understood that the right kind of wrong is truer than mere accuracy. He painted a face that looks at nothing we can see and everything we cannot. And then he finished and put down his brush, and the painting went out into the world without him, into Medici villas and Florentine collections, and the long obscurity after his death, and the pre-Raphaelite recovery, and the 20th century's appetite for reproduction, and the tote bags, and the thumbnails, and the 45-second gallery visits. Through all of it, the shell stayed on the water. Through all of it, the wind kept blowing. Through all of it, the face kept its expression, the one that knows something and carries the knowing lightly and does not look at us. Tonight it looked at you differently, or you looked at it differently. In the dark, without the crowd, without the 45 seconds, with all the time the night allows, you gave it what paintings need and almost never get. Your full and unhurried attention. For as long as it took. Now let the shell settle. Let the wind drop. Let the horror drape the cloak around the goddess's shoulders at last, and let the arrival complete itself, and let Venus step onto the shore and into the world, and into the ordinary time and season that has been waiting for her. She is here now. The arriving is done. And the dark is just the dark, and the night is just the night, and you are exactly where you should be. Sleep now. The orange grove is still. The sea is flat and quiet in the early morning of a Florentine spring 500 years ago. The roses